Hello everybody, and welcome to some RPG horror story cringe with DnD Doge. Games like Dungeons & Dragons are a great way to spend some time with friends and form a fictional world and narrative together. But there is one combination that can turn what would otherwise be an enjoyable time into a nightmare. And that is when you combine a that guy with main character syndrome and a DM that allows it, much like the subject of today's story. But in this example, we find out how some quick thinking can put that guy in his place. So sit back, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and allow me to regale you with this explosive tale. I explode a main character syndrome PC, thus destroying the plot and ending the game. By Reddit user, Status Desk Job. So, hi, I'm new, and this will be my first real social media post. I was told to write this experience here, since this was my real first horror story, and that I should share it with others that may have gone through the same thing. It isn't all bad though, since our that guy had it blow up in his face in the end. This is the story about a railroad, the rest of the party being turned into pawns, and an explosive finale that results in the DM ending the campaign. To set the stage, I joined this gaming group essentially comprised of family and friends. There was about 5 of us players, but I will only list the ones that are important. Me, a Dragonborn Barbarian. Stabby, a Goblin Ranger. The DM, and Protag, a Human Paladin. We've all played D&D before, but only Protag and myself were what I'd call veterans of the game. I hadn't played an in-person game since 2020, so I was very excited to be a part of this one. The game starts off normally enough. We all introduce our player characters, and the party gets a rhythm going. I would honestly say that the intro sessions were great. Lots of roleplay, team bonding, etc. But it all changes when Paladin's backstory kicks in, and now he is some chosen one of his holy order. We all don't think too much of it at first, but over time, his story starts to overshadow everyone else. He's crowned the quote-unquote leader of our troop, had a story beat in all of our backstories, and important enemies who were described as near death 5 rounds ago only go down on his turn. Some were even backstory villains that had nothing to do with him, yet it still seemed like they were catered for him to deal the final blow. Since we were playing in a setting largely comprised of humans as well, me and Stabby were often made to work harder, or secluded from roleplay sessions and meetings with important NPCs. As the story progressed, we even had to pay more for potions and items, unless Protag was with us. Only him, not any of the other players who were also human. Now, let me explain. I don't mind a setting that has these kinds of social dynamics in them. In fact, I find them interesting. I can understand if there are injustices in a D&D setting, since most DMs do this so the player characters can make a difference outside of combat scenarios as well. But since we were at the whims of Protag, and he was more focused on his own power creep, we never really got around to it. He would even use this world-building footnote against our characters later, when he felt that we were stepping out of line. I tried to just roll with it, since I was getting an in-person game. Half of the people here were my family, and I didn't want to ruin it by being a mope. I had already kinda checked out due to all the sidelining, but Stabby, my cousin, was getting sick of it. She starts getting a bit more vocal about the favoritism. This may have provoked Protag to lean further into his own ego, as he didn't appreciate her criticizing his character arc. It's a bit late, but now it's here that I should mention that Protag is a friend of the DM, who in turn is a friend of my other cousin. So before this, half of us didn't really know him. It is my belief that Protag's behavior only began to change after he had become more comfortable with us. So at this point, it was a bit of a drag, but it was about to get a lot worse. Protag got crowned as king of a new nation he formed. Now, if everyone was a side character before, we were all pawns now. Barely any of us got any time to do anything significant outside of roles, as much of the roleplay was taken by Protag. The rest of the party had already given up on our backstories, which was the most depressing thing about this by far. We were nearing what I'd call the end boss of the mid-arc. The party had just dethroned an evil Wizard King, and Protag was doing his Protag screen time interrogations. Most of us were checked out, since it had been about 8 minutes of just the DM and Protag talking, when the DM suddenly made the Wizard King try and kill one of the other player characters. This was supposed to be an epic in-game moment, I presume, but it would end up being the catalyst to the campaign's end. One of us tried to counterspell. Nope, it's too high of a level, and they failed the roll. So we asked what the spell looks like, and it was described as something along the lines of, "You all know its power word kill, so what do you do?" Now we're all paying attention. DM lets us roll initiative to try and roleplay our way out of this, like it was a slow motion intervention, and Stabby ends up rolling the highest. She aims an arrow and ends up killing the Wizard King. We all start to out-of-game celebrate because this was the first boss kill she had gotten since forever. But Protag suddenly marches his paladin up to Stabby and says, "You fool!" Now we're all shocked. Suddenly, the Wizard King rises as a lich due to some magic stuff, and we all have to run away. Back at Protag's castle, Protag is going off about how we royally screwed up his plan. It is then explained that he and the DM had played a few one-on-one sessions without us, and that Protag had information that the rest of us couldn't have possibly even known about. He was also given an amulet that would allow him to imprison the soul of the Wizard King and gain new spells if he had delivered the killing blow. Stabby then says something like, "Big deal, it's not like you need any more power anyways." But that didn't sit well with Protag, since his character was serious and deep, while her character was built off of a joke. Well, how the hell were the other players supposed to know any of this, unless the player or the character tells them the plan? The BPEG was going to kill one of them, and they reacted as any player would. I have a feeling that this story is going to get much worse. But before we find out, I think we all need a kitty intermission. There we go. Now let's find out how Protag brings this whole thing down. By now, his anger is starting to bleed into real life, and he and Stabby are starting to get a bit heated. Stabby, being the mature one, leaves the conversation in-game, and the awkward table atmosphere leads to the party all leaving the castle to do their own things, leaving me and Protag in his throne room by ourselves. I think, hey, maybe I can roleplay now to progress the story, and maybe get it into Protag's head that he should have maybe told us about these important notes. So I try to speak, but he is having a hard time calming down and dials it hard into his roleplay. He calls us all useless and keeps on moping about his now missing power-up. I try again to reiterate that if this was so important, why didn't he tell us? And that's when he attacks me. Yep, just strikes my character, saying something like, "I am king, I owe you all nothing." And DM is a bit shocked, but still allowed it. I think it's just a one-off, but nope, he's taking his annoyance out on me. So I make my barbarian rage and try to flee, but he uses some magical stuff to lock the castle exits. The other players are trying to act now, but Protag says, "You all left. There is no way you know what's going on." I suggest we end the game here, but Protag forces DM to continue since he is having fun again. So I just keep running, locked in his castle as this overpowered chosen one chases me throughout his castle. I briefly think of just letting him kill me so I can drop the game, but then I remembered something. A few sessions ago, we had stopped a band of pirates from blowing up a port. Protag had taken all of their gunpowder in order to try to homebrew some new firearms for his army. So I ran straight to the cellar and hoped that he would follow me. To play it up, I really went hard on the half HP of my barbarian and said, "I go to the cellar to try to hide." It isn't long before Protag corners me in the cellar and starts to repeat this mantra he's always used whenever he kills a big bad. I use my turn to activate my Dragonborn's chromatic warding, telling him to back down in character one last time. He uses his turn to roleplay some random on-the-spot reasoning as to why his character is suddenly being so violent against mine, leaning heavily into the homebrew setting's views on non-human species. Now, at the table, I'm pretty chill about this, so he thinks it's no big deal that he's going to kill my character. He asks me if I'm ready to roll a new one, and even suggests what I should bring to blend in with his kingdom better. On his next turn, he attacks me. I'm barely alive due to barbarian rage at this point, but it's all I need. On my next turn, I use my breath weapon attack on the room and light up the cellar that is full of gunpowder. Now, in the previous session where Protag had gotten his gunpowder stock, Protag had ruled that each exploding barrel was equal to one fireball spell, which the DM allowed. Realizing now that all of his barrels were lighting up in his face, he tried to rule that they were more akin to alchemist flames. But with me and the other players having a laugh at the whole experience, we forced the DM to stay true to the previous ruling. The DM nervously looked to Protag and agreed, and so the dice began to roll. Now, he collected 50 of these things, which are all base level fireballs essentially. At max, he and I would be taking a total of 2,400 fire damage, and at worst, 400 fire damage. Even with his magic items that have the spell damage, there was no way he could survive this, especially with us only being level 8. I, on the other hand, being a red dragonborn who had activated my level 5 chromatic warding feature, was outright immune to fire damage. And that was that. Protag was dead, burnt to a crisp due to about 1,000 or so fire damage. It was, of course, rolled using a dice app, since none of us had that many d6s. I stepped out of the burning hall like a corny action movie, and the DM promptly ended the session. For a while, Protag skimmed through his sheet and mine in order to try and find some loopholes, but came out empty-handed. About a week later, the DM messaged our chat and told us that he was ending the game. Apparently, he didn't know what to do now since Protag's character was dead. He had written so much of the plot around him that there was nothing else he could think of. I said that we could just retcon the previous session, but he just wanted to end it. So, I'm without an in-real-life party again. But if it wasn't for my family also playing there at the table, I would have left so many sessions ago. Honestly, blowing him up was the most fun I had in that game outside of the opening. It was a drag, and none of us had signed up to be a pawn in someone else's power fantasy game. I never talked to the guy again, because we never really talked outside of the game in the first place. The chat died, and we all just moved on. I don't know too much about Protag, so I can't in good conscience say that he was a complete a-hole to the core, but I can say that he was at least a bit too full of himself, and is someone that I wouldn't want to game with going forward. I know this was a long one, but I hope you enjoyed this tangent if you made it this far. Thank you for reading. TLDR. Player becomes chosen one and power trips the rest of the party into the background. Starts a PvP round with me, so I blow him up with his own stock of gunpowder. The game ends because too much of the plot was written around the now dead protagonist of this D&D game. Update. I see some of you asking about the DM, so here's what I can gather about them. As far as I know, they've been a DM before, but I don't know if I'd call them an experienced DM. I think the main issue here was that the DM was a bit of a yes man when it came to their players. I remember someone asking something like, "So when is Protag's arc going to be done?" And he said something like, "Soon." But yeah, it never really ended. In the end, I think it was just more of a lack of self-confidence to deny any of Protag's wants. I do wish them the best though, since the start of the game was promising. They just needed to develop a backbone when going up against aggressive players. Well, that certainly is one way to take care of that situation. Now, normally, I'm against solving table issues in-game, and am a big proponent of talking about game issues above table like adults, and coming to a solution that way. But I would be lying if I said that I didn't get a bit of Schadenfreude after reading that. As a player, you should always be as mindful about including other players at the table as much as the DM should. But it sounds like Protag really didn't care about anyone else, and just wanted to be the main character. And the DM is as much to blame here, as he enabled the main character syndrome. In fact, he encouraged it by making the entire plot revolve around Protag. And this ended up blowing up in the DM's face, as much as it did Protag, since now he had written himself into a corner and had no idea where to take the story now that Protag was blasted into oblivion. It does suck that it essentially made it that OP didn't have an in-real-life game to play in anymore, but at that point, was it really worth it? Though here's hoping that OP can find a new table to play at soon, because let's face it, that whole deal with the explosive barrels was like top tier thinking. And it looks like we have time for one more story. So, let's go. DM Railroad's Party in Boring Star Wars Game by Reddit user Barcode Scandinavian. This is about my first experience ever with any tabletop RPG. A group of friends and family talked about doing a Star Wars D&D style game, and I'm a huge Star Wars nerd, so this was the bait that got me hooked. Out of everyone, only the DM and one player, Hal, were experienced players. DM claimed to know what he was doing, and since he's such an expert storyteller, he would create a great story for us. He wanted to play also, so his idea was to get us started, and then introduce his character when he found someone to take over the DMing role. Now, DM told us that there were no sources to use for a Star Wars version of D&D, so he was going to have to create the whole world on his own through homebrew and set all the rules. We later learned what a lie that was. As we began playing, we swiftly learned that we had no agency. Anything we wanted to do, we had to roll against the DM because there was no DC in place. DM rolled behind his screen, and magically always rolled higher. In combat, he didn't have us roll for initiative because he said he didn't really understand it, which should have been a red flag about how little he knew about tabletop RPGs if we were experienced. Only Hal pushed back on it. Not that it actually mattered. He never had us roll for damage and would just dictate to us how the combat turned out as he railroaded us. He also never gave us XP for anything, so leveling up was out of the question. The only thing that made it fun for us was our RP, because we all had experience acting, so it was enjoyable Star Wars themed improv for us. The last session he was our DM, he told us that he found someone to take over as DM, and he would make sure that they always knew how the story was supposed to go. He also said that he'd make his character in a way that would make them the most powerful character possible. We were annoyed because he had made sure that we'd all be weak, and that session was the most boring game ever. He had us running through a tunnel for 2 hours, unable to outrun stormtroopers despite a head start. Eventually, we were all stunned without the ability to fight or use saving rolls, and Hal was taken captive. Then, the session ended with an introduction to DM's Mary Sue character. Both his trash DM style and issues that took place out of game caused us to boot DM from the game and our lives. We really wanted to keep the story going, so we ended up deciding to DM by committee, taking turns as DM with our character sideline during those sessions. By studying how to DM, I learned everything we had been doing was wrong, and I also discovered several versions of Star Wars tabletop RPGs, so it was obvious he hadn't even looked. We've continued to play, and have added 2 other players, and it has been great. It opened the door to other D&D for me, and I absolutely love the world of tabletop RPGs. TLDR. DM pretends to know what he's doing, railroads the party into boring games without player agency, just to set himself up as the great savior, until the party kicks him out and has fun without him. No saves? No initiative? Hell, no damage rolls? At that point, it isn't even a game. It sounds like DM just wanted everyone to take place in his Star Wars fanfiction power fantasy. Though, at least this nightmare of an experience led OP to learning the game by taking turns DMing, and finding a love for the hobby. Usually, experiences like these lead people to never look at the hobby again, and that always sucks. But that is all the time we have for today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain that guy free. Until next time.